GDP comes in as a surprise.
You might have heard politicians, economists, and journalists talking about GDP and GDP growth. But what exactly is this multi-trillion measure? And what does it mean to all of us? Well, GDP is one of the most widely used metrics in the field of economics, particularly in macroeconomics, a field concerned with how the economy performs at large. GDP was originally developed during the Great Depression in the 1930s by Simon Smith Kuznets, a Russian-born American economist and statistician who received the Nobel Memorial Prize in Economics in 1971. It was later adopted as a standard measure of economic performance in 1944 at the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference, which is known as Bretton Woods, where it became a central metric for macroeconomic analysis. When you hear experts talking about GDP, you should keep in mind that GDP is not a perfect economic measure for several reasons that we will explain in this video. Let's start with its definition. GDP, a gross domestic product, represents the monetary value of all finished goods and services made within a country during a specific period. In simple terms, it reflects the total value of a country's economic output and the total value of its income. There are two types of GDP, nominal and real GDP. Nominal GDP is the value of all goods and services produced in an economy at current prices. It shows the economic output of a specific period without adjusting for changes in price levels. Think of it as the sticker price for everything produced. Real GDP, on the other hand, is adjusted for inflation. By accounting for changes in price levels, real GDP allows for more accurate comparisons over time, showing the true increase in production and services. So, while nominal GDP tells us the overall economic size, real GDP gives better insight into economic growth and living standards. Let's see an example on this. Imagine you have a basket of fruits that cost $100 in 2023. In 2024, the same basket costs $110 because prices went up due to inflation. The nominal GDP would show $110 for 2024. But to see the real growth, we adjust for inflation and find that real GDP is still $100, indicating no real growth in the quantity of fruits, just higher prices. While nominal GDP shows us the size of the economy in current terms, real GDP shows us the true growth by removing the effect of inflation. GDP is used at a national level to gauge economic activity within a country's borders. For instance, based on data from the World Bank, the United States has the highest GDP in the world in 2022, with a staggering $25.4 trillion, with China being second with a GDP of $18 trillion. At a global level, GDP tracks the economic activity and growth of the world economy. In 2023, the global GDP reached an impressive $104.5 trillion. Organizations and international institutions, such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund, IMF, closely monitor global GDP growth on a quarterly and annual basis. These institutions provide critical analyses and forecasts that help governments, businesses, and investors understand economic trends and make informed decisions. This constant tracking and reporting of global GDP and other metrics ensures that policymakers and economists can respond to economic challenges and opportunities as they arise. So, what makes up GDP? There are four key components: consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. These make up a simple equation. GDP equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. C stands for consumption. This constitutes the largest component of GDP and includes all private expenditures by households and businesses. It covers spending on goods and services such as food, rent, medical expenses, and other personal consumption expenditures. I represents investment. This includes spending on capital goods that will be used for future production. It encompasses business investments in equipment and infrastructure, residential construction, and changes in business inventories. G stands for government spending. This consists of government expenditures on goods and services that directly benefit the public, such as defense, education, public safety, and infrastructure projects. It excludes transfer payments like pensions and unemployment benefits, since they don't reflect direct purchases of goods and services. X minus M represents net exports. This is the value of a country's exports, X, minus its imports, M. Exports add to GDP, as they are goods and services produced domestically and sold abroad, while imports are subtracted because they represent spending on foreign-produced goods and services. So how is GDP calculated in real life? GDP is calculated by summing up the total value of all goods and services produced within a country's borders over a specific time period, usually annually or quarterly. There are three main approaches to calculating GDP. Number one, production or output approach. This approach adds the value of output produced by each sector of the economy. Number 2, income approach. This method sums up all incomes earned by individuals and businesses, including wages, profits, and taxes minus subsidies. And number 3, expenditure approach. This totals all spending on final goods and services, including consumption, investment, government spending, and net exports. Exports minus imports. Each method should theoretically result in the same GDP figure, offering different perspectives on economic activity. This is easier said than done, as in reality, discrepancies can arise due to data collection issues and methodological differences. For example, in India, GDP figures calculated using the income and expenditure approaches often show significant differences. A notable study, India's GDP Misestimation, Likelihood, Magnitudes, Mechanisms, and Implications by Arvind Subramanian, an economics professor and former chief economic advisor to the government of India, highlights significant overestimation of GDP growth due to changes in data sources and methodology since 2011 to 2012. When measuring a country's economic performance, it's also important to understand the difference between gross domestic product, GDP, and gross national product, GNP. They sound very similar, but aren't the same. GDP measures the total value of goods and services produced within a country's borders. GNP, or gross national product, measures the total value of goods and services produced by a country's residents, no matter where they are. Whilst GDP takes into account consumption, government spending, investment, and net exports, GNP is made up of domestic income plus foreign income, minus foreign payments. In summary, GDP focuses on the location of production, while GNP focuses on who produces it, regardless of where the production takes place. This distinction is particularly useful for countries with strong multinational corporations, significant foreign investments, or a large number of citizens working abroad. For example, in the case of Bangladesh, GNP is often higher than GDP due to substantial remittances from Bangladeshi workers abroad. In 2019, Bangladesh's GNP was higher than its GDP because its income earned by Bangladeshis working overseas contributed significantly to the national income. This discrepancy highlights the importance of considering both measures to get a full picture of economic performance. While politicians, economists, and journalists talk about economic growth, they refer to an increase in real GDP over consecutive quarters. This is expressed as a percentage change compared to the prior period and is known as the GDP growth rate or economic growth rate. Conversely, if real GDP falls for 2 consecutive quarters, it's called a recession. For example, during the Great Recession of the late 2000s, the U.S. economy contracted for 4 consecutive quarters from Q3 2008 through Q2 2009. Why is GDP growth so important? Growth means more goods and services are produced, leading to higher employment rates and increased tax revenue. During a recession, unemployment rises, businesses shut down, and tax revenue decreases. GDP growth also boosts consumer confidence, leading to more spending and investment. It encourages businesses to invest in new projects, equipment, and hiring, which can lead to long-term benefits. It signals a strong economy, attracting more domestic and foreign investment. Higher economic growth per capita improves living standards and reduces poverty rates. Apart from GDP growth rate, there are several other economic measures that include GDP, often utilized by economists and financial analysts to provide a more comprehensive view of an economy's health. These include GDP per capita. While comparing the economic activities of different countries, GDP per capita measures the value output per person. This is calculated by dividing the annual GDP of a country by its population. Why does this matter? Because GDP alone doesn't account for population size. For example, in 2022, China's GDP was around 18 trillion, while Switzerland's was just 818 billion, or 0.8 trillion. At first glance, China's GDP is nearly 22 times larger, but considering population size, China had 1.4 billion people, while Switzerland had around 9 million. China's GDP per capita was $12,829, whereas Switzerland's was $90,889. Indicating a much higher standard of living in Switzerland. If the population of a country rises, GDP growth could be attributed to population growth. Conversely, if a country's population remains stable and GDP rises, it could be due to technological progress and innovations, government spending, or rise in consumer spending, or an increase in exports. For instance, over the past 2 decades, Singapore, despite having only a small increase in population, has seen its GDP growth rise significantly. This growth is primarily driven by its strategic position as a global financial hub, its advanced technology sector, and its robust trade activities. The country's open economic policies, which have attracted investment from foreign companies, known as foreign direct investments, or FDI, has also played a crucial role in boosting its economic performance. Debt to GDP ratio. This metric measures a country's public debt in relation to its GDP. It indicates the country's ability to pay back its debt. A lower ratio suggests a stronger ability to manage and repay debt, whereas a higher ratio might indicate potential difficulties in debt servicing. For instance, Japan has a debt-to-GDP ratio of over 230%, which raises concerns about its debt sustainability, despite having a strong economy. Current account balance as a percentage of GDP. This measure compares a country's current account balance, exports minus imports, plus net income and direct payments, to its GDP. It indicates economic stability and competitiveness. A positive balance suggests a net exporter status, while a negative balance indicates a net importer status. Germany often has a positive current account balance as a percentage of GDP, reflecting its strong export sector, especially in automobiles and machinery. Investment to GDP ratio. This ratio reflects the level of investment in an economy by dividing gross fixed capital formation by GDP. It shows the proportion of GDP being reinvested for future growth, indicating the potential for future economic expansion. China has a high investment to GDP ratio, which has been a significant driver of its rapid economic growth through infrastructure development and industrial expansion. Trade to GDP ratio. This metric indicates the openness of an economy by dividing the sum of exports and imports by GDP. It highlights the degree of international trade involvement and is a measure of economic globalization. Singapore has a very high trade to GDP ratio due to its strategic location and role as a global trade hub, with trade volumes exceeding its GDP. Savings to GDP ratio. This metric measures the proportion of GDP that is saved by dividing national savings by GDP. It provides insight into the economy's capacity for future investment, indicating financial health and stability. For example, India has a relatively high savings to GDP ratio, which supports investment in infrastructure and industry, fueling economic growth. Government spending as a percentage of GDP. This measure reflects the size and role of the government in the economy by comparing government expenditures to GDP. It indicates the extent of government intervention and spending in the economy. And for example, in countries like Sweden, government spending as a percentage of GDP is high, reflecting its extensive welfare programs and public services. Why looking at GDP alone can be misleading. While GDP is a crucial measure, relying on it alone can be misleading. GDP doesn't account for income distribution. A growing GDP can mask rising inequality. The Gini coefficient is a metric used to measure income disparity. It ranges from 0, representing perfect equality, to 100%, representing perfect inequality. For instance, South Africa has a high Gini index of about 63%, indicating considerable inequality, despite having a relatively high GDP in its region. High GDP doesn't reflect living costs. Differences in living costs can make GDP per capita misleading. For example, Switzerland's high GDP per capita contrasts sharply with Germany's, but Switzerland also has a much higher cost of living. Using purchasing power parity, PPP, adjusts GDP for these cost differences, providing a more accurate comparison of economic well-being. For instance, if $1 buys more goods in Germany than in Switzerland, PPP-adjusted GDP shows that people in Germany have a strong purchasing power, despite Germany's low nominal GDP per capita. GDP ignores environmental costs. Economic growth can lead to pollution and resource depletion. China's rapid GDP growth has been accompanied by significant environmental damage, including high carbon emissions, severe air pollution, and water scarcity. According to the Global Carbon Atlas, in 2021, China's carbon emissions accounted for nearly 1/3 of the world's total carbon emissions. GDP doesn't measure education, healthcare, or well-being. Despite high GDP, the United States ranks lower in healthcare and education outcomes compared to some countries with lower GDPs, like Finland or Norway. GDP excludes informal activities like volunteer work and black market transactions. In many large and developing countries such as India, a significant part of economic activities occur in the informal sector, which GDP calculations often overlook. GDP reports are delayed and may not reflect real-time conditions. During sudden economic shocks, such as the 2008 financial crisis or the COVID-19 pandemic, GDP data lagged behind real-time indicators. Alternative GDP metrics explained. If GDP is imperfect, what are the alternatives? Some important metrics are the Human Development Index, or HDI, was developed by the United Nations Development Program. It covers life expectancy, education, and income indicators. The Human Development Index provides a broader measure of development by considering not just economic growth, but also the well-being and capabilities of people. It includes three main components. Life expectancy reflects the average lifespan of a population, indicating the overall health and longevity of people. Education encompasses the average years of schooling for adults and expected years of schooling for children, highlighting the importance of knowledge and learning opportunities. And income indicators. Gross national income per capita, adjusted for purchasing power parity, measures the average income and economic resources available to individuals. In 2022, the top-performing countries in HDI were Switzerland, Norway, and Iceland. The Social Product Index, or SPI, was developed by the Social Progress Imperative, a U.S.-based nonprofit organization. It measures social and environmental outcomes directly, rather than relying on economic indicators. It includes basic human needs, foundations of well-being, and opportunity. For example, in 2022, the top-performing countries were Norway, Finland, and Denmark. The Social Progress Index provides a comprehensive measure of societal progress by focusing on social and environmental aspects that contribute to overall well-being. It consists of basic human needs, access to essentials like water, food, and shelter, foundations of well-being, access to education, information, and health services, and opportunity, personal rights, freedom of choice, and access to advanced education. This index highlights the factors that influence a society's overall quality of life beyond economic measures. Some of the top countries in the Social Progress Index for 2021 include Norway, Finland, Denmark, Iceland, and Switzerland. The Happy Planet Index, or HPI, was developed by the New Economics Foundation, a British think tank. It measures environmental impact and well-being. In 2022, the top-performing countries were Vanuatu, Sweden, and El Salvador. The Happy Planet Index focuses on sustainable well-being by evaluating how effectively countries provide long, happy, and sustainable lives for their citizens. It focuses on well-being, life expectancy, and environmental footprint. The Better Life Index, or BLI, is developed by the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, or OECD. It measures quality of life based on various factors such as housing, income, jobs, and education. In 2022, the top countries included Australia, Sweden, and Canada. So why do politicians and economists focus so much on GDP? Despite its flaws, GDP remains popular due to its simplicity, long-standing use, and the absence of a universally accepted alternative. GDP is easy to communicate and compare, but as mentioned, it doesn't provide the full picture and should be taken with a grain of salt. As mentioned, it should be considered alongside other measures, such as inequality, environmental impact, health and well-being, education, and social mobility, for a more comprehensive understanding of economic and social progress. Despite its limitations and shortcomings, it doesn't seem that GDP will be replaced by any other measure anytime soon. Nonetheless, as people around the world become more informed and place greater emphasis on well-being, health, education, and the environment, GDP will increasingly share the stage with other metrics. Thanks for watching. Please like and subscribe for more detailed economics videos.